Thank you for joining today. This is our deep dive webinar, Life QI. I've got a fairly long list of things on the agenda there, which hopefully you can see that we're going to go through today. So we'll get started in a minute. Just first of all, a few bits of housekeeping, as it were. If you've got any questions as we go through this, please do ask. We are kind of interested and want to make this as helpful and useful as possible and be able to respond to your questions. So you could pop them in the Q&A section, then one of my colleagues will pick them up and we'll look to answer them as we go through the session. Or if there's anything you want to share more broadly with the audience or just with us as panelists, you can use the chat. But it'd be helpful if you could put your questions in the Q&A. It makes it a bit easier for us to kind of manage them in order as we go through. Quite a few subjects we're going to try and cover off. We will provide links to various bits of information, partly as we go through the session, but also at the end, we'll share a long list of kind of useful links and learning resources as well. So it doesn't matter if you don't quite take in everything that we cover, because we do have a lot to cover. We'll share some links at the end and also make the recording available for people if they want to kind of watch it back at any point. Yeah, let's get started. So quite a bit to get through today. As I said, we're going to start off by talking about some of the chart types and how to choose them, and then we're going to launch into the actual functionality and show you how to use it within Life QI. So to begin with, chart types available and how to choose them. I'm going to start out on the Life QI blog because it's got some information here about statistical process control. And one of the items we've got down here, which just bear with me as I scroll down to, is the different SPC chart types that we have in Life QI. So just bring this into view. So as well as run charts, there are 7 different types of control chart that are available you can use on your projects. Not going to go through all of those in detail and kind of describe them one by one, but just partly make you aware of the range of charts that are available. What we do find is that run chart is the one that people are kind of most comfortable with and tend to use the most, but the other control charts are there and are certainly applicable when appropriate for certain types of data that you may be recording. And wherever possible, it's obviously good to use a control chart, the right kind of control chart, if you can understand which one meets the needs of your data. We do have an article that will help you decide that. So just up here, picking the right chart type every time. I'll bring that up. I'm going to talk you through this briefly before we dive into the system itself. So we've got on this particular article, we've got a useful sort of decision tree to help you guide through making the relevant selection. We have something slightly different in the system that I'll show you in a few moments, but it's useful just to talk through the decision tree first of all. Fairly straightforward question. It seems like at the top here, what type of data are you collecting? It's not necessarily that easy to answer, and it's really about whether your data is continuous, i.e. measured data, or whether it's discrete counted data. That's useful enough explanation for some people, but not necessarily for everyone. So a bit further down this article, there is a bit more information as to, what do we mean by counted data, or what do we mean by measured data? So counted being things like the number of people on a ward, number of people with a particular condition, those sorts of things. Whereas the measured data is going to be something that's not quite as binary in that sense. So, the weight of the person, the height of a person, the distance of something being kind of the measured type data. So that's really the first key decision to be made when deciding which chart type, because that's going to guide you down one of the 2 main branches within this decision tree. So you're either then going to end up with an X bar S or an I chart, depending on the number of sample groups you've got. Examples of sample groups would be, are you collecting data in one hospital, one sample group, or multiple hospitals? You'd have multiple sample groups. That would direct you down the relevant one of these. Over here on this side, down the discrete counted side, it's more about, are you measuring a rare event? And a bit further down the article, there's an explanation as to what we mean by a rare event. The yes, no there will guide you down one of these 2 routes to either end up one of the rare data, rare event charts, or whether probably the more commonly used charts on this side of the decision tree, basically. So that's, really useful article. I think we've shared in the chat already. I'd certainly recommend having a read through that. We also have what we call like an SPC cheat sheet, which is a PDF that you can download that's got this decision tree on it, as well as some other bits of information about the different chart types that are available. And we can share a link to that a bit later as well. So that's a useful one to have a look at. What we'll do now is we'll actually dive into the system itself, and we'll have a bit of a look through how you create these measured charts and how you put your data in. The key area that you're going to do that is within the project space, or within an individual project. So I've got a project that I'm already running called Reducing Pressure Source. I'm in that project area. If you haven't got a project already, you will need to create one before you can start creating these charts. Once you have that project set up, you'll see you have a measures and charts page, which you can get to just by clicking on the tab here, or there's also a link to it down here on the general page as well. Clicking on that, it will load up this measures page. As I said, I'm already running this project, so I've already got quite a lot in the way of charts. We can see each of my different measures is listed out here, and they're grouped by the type. So my outcome measure at the top here, got a series of process measures, and then your space for your balance measures at the bottom there. The information listed out against each of these is the kind of the bold text is the name of the measure. In light grey here, we can see how frequently we're recording data against each of these measures, and there are a number of different options, which I'll show you in a minute. Helpfully, but rather embarrassingly, data's overdue, and it kind of just highlights that for me on all of these, so it's fairly obvious the charts that I need to go into an update, which is helpful. And then the spark line just gives me a bit of a preview as to how much data I've got and kind of the general trend of that data. It also makes it easy to see if you didn't have any data, for example, there wouldn't be a spark line. If you want to open up one of these measures and start adding any data, you just click on the relevant row and it will open that up, and you can kind of go through that process. But what we're going to do now is go through the process of creating a new measure and a new chart, and kind of take that a bit more step by step. So this grey button over here is the new measure button. I'm going to click that every time you need to create a new measure. This is where you're going to want to come, and it's going to guide us through kind of a step-by-step short wizard, a three-step wizard to get set up with this new measure, basically. There are a couple of mandatory fields, which we're going to see here, highlighted in red. So I need to give my measure a name. So for example, I have to give it a name, and I have to select one of the types. So just clicking into the drop down, you can see the options that become available. If I'm not quite sure what we mean by measure type, we've got these little information icons, or tooltips as they're called. If you click on those, it will pop up a little bit more guidance. So in this case, it gives me an explanation of what an outcome measure is, a process measure and a balance measure. So those little tooltips are on most fields in the system, and just provide you that extra little bit of guidance if you're not quite sure. Once I filled out those two, those are pretty much the only mandatory fields that I'm going to have to select. The rest are optional. So here I have this operational definition, and again, a little bit of information here to help me understand what I should be writing in there. But you don't have to fill that out. You're not quite sure yet, or it's maybe someone else's responsibility to fully define that. You can skip over that and come back to that later. Similarly with the data collection plan, again, useful guidance in there, but you can come back and fill that out later. Couple of choices here. These in a way do have to be filled out, but they're pre-filled for you, so you don't have to change them if you don't wish to. The first is the chart type. So clicking into that is going to show us the list that we saw in that blog article a few moments ago. So you've got the full list of all the control charts, plus you've got the run chart option. Now, for some people, this simple list is enough information to make that decision. They've understood the data that they've got, but not for everyone. Certainly a lot of people are unsure as to when to use some of those different control charts. So we've got an extra little guide down here. Need help choosing a chart, and this is particularly useful. So click on that, it's going to pop up this extra window here. And then along the top here, we have the different chart types, and you can essentially kind of browse or flick through these. And for each of the chart types, it will give you a description, the sort of information you're going to need there. Typical examples of when you might use, in this case, a P chart. So this makes it fairly clear it's to do with percentages, and the data that you're going to need to capture. So I've got time, count, and total, or numerator and denominator here. And as I flick through the different chart types, you're going to see all of that changes. Information is always specific to that chart type. And here, for example, data to capture for an XBAR-S, there's going to be more information that needs to be captured, more columns in that data sheet, essentially. Once you've found the one that is relevant for your data type, you can simply confirm that by clicking the button down the bottom here. So for the sake of what I'm collecting here, I'm going to use a P chart, but you obviously pick the one that's most relevant to you. It's worth noting that you can't change the chart type after you've created the measure and set it up. you would have to duplicate the measure and pick a different chart type if you wanted to change it later. There isn't really a switching mechanism yet, simply because there are some complexities with changing different chart types aren't necessarily interchangeable. So that's not quite available. You would have to recreate that measure, as I said. Next step in this wizard is then the data collection frequency. Again, click into the drop down and it will give you the options you have available. There are some sort of fixed frequency options available here, and then there's a couple of options down here. If it's either kind of custom unknown or it's not necessarily specifically date based, you'll just be able to put in some free text that will appear along that x-axis. But for the most part, most people tend to select one of these. It's particularly useful if you're going to be measuring the same thing in different locations, different wards or different hospitals, and you want to be able to aggregate that data. You're only going to be able to aggregate multiple charts together if you picked one of the fixed frequency charts. So for the sake of today, I'm going to pick my monthly chart, monthly data frequency rather, and then it will know how to lay out the x-axis on that. And then click through to the final step before I complete this measure setup, which is I can link this measure back to any of my drivers. So it gives me an opportunity to link it to some part of that driver diagram that I've already set up for this particular project. You don't have to do that. You can skip over and just create the measure. But if you do want to, you click link driver. And then you get another one of these drop downs where basically I need to pick, am I going to link it to AIM or one of the primary or secondary drivers? If I click into the primary driver option, and then click here, it gives me these are my 3 primary drivers. It's looking at my driver diagram. So select that one and then click the plus. It's going to make that linkage. I can link further drivers if I wish to do so. Otherwise, I move on. I'm just going to click create measure, and then we will pause for a second. I think there might have been, has there been a hand raised or a question come through?
Yeah, looks like we've had a hand raise from Laura. I've just gone back to her, so just waiting for her to come through. But feel free, anybody, if you'd like to ask questions, there should be a Q&A box at the bottom of Zoom. If you click on that, any questions you have, feel free to pop them in there, and we can refer to those, or in the chat is absolutely fine. So as soon as that one comes through, Jason, I'll let you know, and yeah, we'll answer that. Okay,
great, thank you. Yeah, feel free to chip in with questions. We'll try and pick them up as we go through. Okay, next steps then, let's keep moving. So I've created the measure and I've now been taken into that measure. But what I now need to do is kind of the second step is actually creating the chart basically. And it's a 2-step process: define the measure and then create the chart and start adding the data. And the reason it's a 2-step process is you have the opportunity to create multiple charts against an individual measure. Typical scenario here being you might be collecting data across multiple locations, but it's all the same measure and it's going to be the same sort of time period and things like that. So in order to be able to do that and have a chart per hospital or chart per ward or whatever it might be, you're able to set up these separate charts. And then once you have these charts, it will then automatically aggregate them for you as well.
Hi, Jace. Sorry to interrupt you. Just a couple of questions that have come in, if it's okay, just to sort of go through those. One is, will you be showing how to aggregate charts?
Yeah, we'll cover that once we start putting some data in. We'll see that.
And the second question is, are you able to change frequency of data collection, such as weekly to monthly or daily to weekly on the same chart?
Sure. Okay, let's try and answer that one now. It's not possible to change the data collection frequency on the chart, or once you've started plotting that. A bit like the chart type, once it's created, that then kind of remains fixed. So again, if you wanted to change it, you would need to do the same kind of process of changing the chart type, which is recreate the measure and select a different data collection frequency at that point. Depending on the level of raw data you've collected, you might have that information already, but the kind of scenarios, the things that the system's going to struggle with is if you've put in weekly data, it's not going to be able to break that down and make that weekly data unless you all happen to have the kind of that daily raw data, in which case you need to create it again, I'm afraid. So yeah, there's a few, if you like, limitations or complexities around switching types and switching frequencies. But yeah, we'll show the aggregation piece when we get to that. Although the answer is fairly simple in that it will automatically aggregate it for you once you've got multiple sources.
Just one more quick question.
Yeah.
Is that better to select custom stroke unknown if you are not sure if the frequency has to be changed at a later stage?
Yes, that would allow you to essentially put in weekly dates and then start putting in daily dates if that's what you wanted to do. The kind of the limiting factor there is going to be if you want to aggregate data from multiple charts, it's not going to be able to do that if you pick the kind of the custom unknown option, because it's not necessarily going to be able to detect the dates in the same way and match the dates up. So that would be the kind of the limiting factor there. But certainly if you're recording it in one place, it's going to be one chart and you're unsure about that frequency, then yeah, custom unknown will allow you to put in kind of whatever frequency and vary that frequency through the lifetime of the chart. Okay, happy for me to carry on, Gary?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, let's get going with, so now we've created that measure. The next prompt here is add a chart. Basically, it's another grey button. Whenever you're kind of adding or editing something, it tends to be the grey button over on the right hand side here. So click that, and there's just a few things to get set up here quickly. So the chart name, and again, you might think, well, we've already named this measure, but the idea being, if we're going to have multiple charts, then we have to be able to name each of those charts so we can detect where the data is coming from. So you can use whatever naming conventions you want, but I'm going to do, so assuming that we've got the data coming in here from our Abbey ward, I'm going to name the chart Abbey ward in that sense. And then you've got the very beginnings of your data sheet. So these are going to be essentially my column headings that are going to appear, and I'm going to be able to build out my data underneath those. So if I don't have to add any data now, I can just click create chart. But if I've already got some baseline data or at least one row's worth of data, I click add row. And I've now got a couple of options as to how I add data, and these remain the same once the chart's already populated. I can just click into each of these cells and kind of, pick a date, type in a number, that sort of thing. If I've just got one row's worth of data, that's what I'm going to do. But you can also copy and paste data. So if you've got a spreadsheet that's already got a big backlog of all of your baseline data, we can go and copy and paste that and dump all of that data in here, and it will kind of paste in as many rows as we've got. So that's a fairly common scenario, particularly if you've already got the baseline data. So I'm going to do that, show you how to do that. If I scroll over to my spreadsheet, hopefully the screen share will pull across to this. So I've already got some data. The key thing to point out here is I need to make sure that my spreadsheet is formatted in the same way that my Life QI chart is going to be, in terms of the columns of data and the order of those and the frequency of those. So I picked a monthly data collection frequency. So in my spreadsheet, I've got months, I've got counts, and I've got totals. So I can just come in here and highlight all of my baseline data, and then just either Control C or right click, and I'm going to copy that. So I've copied the relevant number of columns and all of the rows that I need. If I scroll back over to Life QI, to paste that data in, all I need to do is just click into this first cell, essentially click into the date cell, and then either just click Control V or right click and kind of paste in there. It'll take a second and it should just paste all of that data in. So I can now see that all of that data has kind of been pasted in, and it's created as many rows as I needed based on all that baseline data. So that's there, and it's kind of ready for me now. So simply confirm that, click create chart, and it's going to save all of that. Give that a second and it will create the chart. So yeah, it's created that. If I now have some baseline data from another, in fact, let's go through that process and we can show the aggregate chart will be created. So let's go quickly go through that process. So I've got Bay Ward, scroll over, I've got their data as well. Copy that, come back over here. Paste that in, scroll down to the bottom, click create chart. So you can see that I've now got a link through to Abbey Ward's chart and to the Bay Ward chart, and the aggregate chart will appear down here in a moment. So what we'll do now is we'll kind of go into one of these charts and I can show you how we can kind of update and edit those charts, and then we'll come back and we'll look at the aggregate shortly, basically. So if I just click on one of these rows, it's going to open up that chart so we can start to look at it in a bit more detail. So you can now see it's a P chart, as I mentioned earlier. This is the name of that measure. We can see that we're looking at Abbey Ward's chart. And if we just scroll down slightly, that chart will come into view. Scroll past that, we've then got the data sheet underneath it. So this is all the data that I've entered in already. And this is where I'm going to come down to add or edit any of the data that I've got. I want to make any changes either to the chart or to the data. And the first thing I need to do is up the top here, we've got this edit button. So in a similar sort of place to where we have the add buttons, we have edit buttons. Just means that you don't accidentally make any changes. To make changes, I'm going to need to click edit. But now the chart and the data sheet become editable. So if I scroll back down here, I can then see this table has become slightly different. So I can now click in and change these numbers. If I want to change that 12 to a 14 or whatever, I can click in and do that. I can delete a row. And if I scroll down to the bottom, it'll give me the option to add more rows. So in the same way that I added rows before, I can click in there, type in one more row's worth of data, or copy and paste in kind of more data after that, basically. So those kind of options remain available for you. And yeah, that's always where you'll come back to add more data to the chart. As soon as you, in fact, let's show you doing that because it'll make a bit more sense. So if I go down to here, so I've got August 19, I'll click add row. Because it's monthly, it's kind of pre-populated it that I need September's data. But if I go back to my spreadsheet, grab the rest of my data, just going to click into that cell, click paste. So it's added that data in from September. And now if I scroll back up to my chart, my internet will keep up. So it can detect that I've changed the data within the chart. So it's asking me if I'd like to redraw it. So I just click redraw. Oh, what have I done there? I pasted in the wrong data. Come out of that. I pasted in the wrong values there. Yeah, I would redraw the chart and it would just add the newest data onto the end of the chart, basically. So let's just stick with this baseline data that we've got for the moment and now talk about how we edit the chart, how we kind of update that, how we can kind of annotate it and things like that. Again, you're going to have to click edit to make that chart editable, but then I can come in here and I can start to click on the data points and see the different options that become available. So let's say I wanted to kind of, at the moment the chart's in its baseline phase, let's say I want to kind of finish the baseline phase around here and move into a test phase. I would need to click on the data point against which I want to make those changes, basically. So clicking on that data point pops up this little menu here. I've got some information at the top here, which gives me a bit more information about this particular data point. So it's time period, count, total value, those sorts of things, and what the value of the centerline upper and lower control limits are at this particular point. Other options I've got then here is notes, so I can add an annotation. So I'm going to put in a little note here, end of baseline. We'll see that appear in a minute. I could also link in a PDSA cycle. I won't do it at this point. We'll do that a bit later in the chart. But then the phase controls we've got down here. So this is if I want to move from my baseline phase into my test phase, we need to click next phase. And we're sort of saying we want to move into that next phase. Little warnings popped up here to say I'm moving out of my baseline phase after only a few data points, and that's not necessarily best practice. I can do that, but it's just giving me a warning. It would probably be a more reliable baseline if I'd collected more than 15 points. So yeah, are you sure you want to move on regardless? Yes. Okay, basically. So you can see at the top now the chart's changed. So the baseline phase is up to this point here. There's a little grey marker there, and it now says that we've moved into the test phase. So it's kind of recorded that. And if I click save on the chart, and then reload the chart, it will have recalculated some of that data. So by kind of saving and reloading the chart, we can see some of the changes have happened here. So this center line in the baseline period has now been fixed. So that's no longer going to change. And it's also then been projected forward into this test phase. And you can see it's become this dotted line, and the control limits have become dotted and become static at the moment. So those are now fixed and projected forward. So as I add more data, these control limits aren't going to change at the moment. It's going to continue to project the baseline period forward, basically.
Jace, just a very quick question about the control lines, just whilst you're on it. It did, somebody's just come in saying, will the control line be measured automatically?
Yeah, so all of the control limits and the center line get calculated and plotted for you automatically. So essentially you're responsible for putting the data in this case, count and total. It's figured out the percentage line, it will plot that for you. But then the chart will automatically detect your center line, it will calculate the different limits, upper and lower, and the different sigma as well, and it's plotting those for you. So there's no calculation that you need to do yourselves. And then further to that, it will also detect any special cause variation in the data. And it will highlight that using these pink boxes at the top that we'll talk about in a bit more detail in a minute. So yeah, none of the calculation needs to be done by yourself. It was all taken care of by the software. And as soon as you add more data, it redoes those calculations for you, those sorts of things. So it's trying to make that part of the process as straightforward as possible. And frankly, there's no reason why you should need to remember what all those different rules are. The software can remember that, can calculate that in a split second, basically. Same way when it comes to setting these control limits and recalculating them, you don't need to recalculate them, it will do that for you. So yeah, I guess if we talk about recalculating control limits, we've got our baseline phase, we've projected that forward, but let's say from this point we wanted to start recalculating them, we can do that. Again, to make changes to the chart, we're going to click the edit button. Click back into this, say it's this from this data point. We click into that now, we're going to see an extra option that's appeared down here, which is limit calculations. So I can start recalculating the control limits from this point forward, basically. So I click that. It's going to do that, and then save that change and then refresh the chart so it can recalculate. Just in case of kind of closing it, reopening it. So that's saying, so I've got this fixed period here, I've projected that forward into the beginning of my test phase. And let's say I started testing something here, or I started seeing a difference in the data. What I've then done is instigate this recalculation. So the center line of control limits are now being recalculated from this point, taking into account all of these data points, basically. So as I continue to add data, we might see these control limits shift according to the profile of the data, basically. So you can see we've now got a few different profiles or a few different sections to that chart. As I said, it's going to keep recalculating those control limits until I basically ask it to stop recalculating those control limits, or until I move into the next phase of the chart. If I did wish to stop that recalculation, we're going to go through the same sort of process. So again, click edit, click onto the data point against which I want to stop that process. And then down here, I can end that limit recalculation, or I can even reset the calculation to get rid of the changes that I've just made. Let's do that, end that limit calculation. The other thing we're going to do before we kind of save and refresh that is talk about kind of adding the PDSA cycles. I mentioned that briefly before. If I click against one of the data points that I want to link my PDSA cycle to, so typically being at this point in time, I started running a PDSA cycle, I want to link it to this data point whilst the chart is in edit mode still. I'm going to click into that data point, click into the PDSA section, and it's going to give me a list of the different PDSA cycles that I've already got created for this particular project. So it's worth noting, if you haven't already created any of those PDSA cycles, you will need to do that first. They then become available here to be selected. Make that selection, and it's going to then appear above the chart for me. Let's do that. Click save. Let's reopen that for us. Click back into there. So now see that PDSA cycle little icon has appeared up there. And if I click on that, it pops open the name of that PDSA cycle. So I can quite clearly see when I started running this test of change. In the same sort of way, the note that I added back here, if I click on that, see that that's my note that I added there. And that further change I made back here about finishing the limit recalculation has triggered that, and that's now become a dotted line projecting those new points forward into the future, basically. Okay, so we've got that. Come back to these special cause variation up here that I mentioned briefly before. So wherever Life QI detects that you've got any special cause variation in your data or in this process, it's going to automatically flag that for you using these pink boxes at the top. There are, I think it's 5 different types of special cause variation that we look for and automatically output on the chart where it's relevant. The names of them might be difficult to see on the screen share, but the names of them are all written underneath. And if you click on it, it'll give you the definition of that. So I can click on this one and can see, it gives me the definition of what we mean by an outlier. Similarly with high variation. So it's automatically looking for those and it will highlight those for you. It's then just left to you to interpret whether that's good high variation or bad high variation. You know, are we shifting the line, kind of the variation in the right direction or not? Basically, it's kind of up to you to interpret that, but it does that part of the analysis piece for you essentially. And there is, I think we've got another article just to make it clear. The types of special cause variation we're looking for. One of our articles, Anatomy of a Control Chart. If you scroll down here, it talks about these different elements and explains them, the control limits, but there's a piece here around special cause variation. So you can see that we are looking for trends, high variation, outliers, shifts, and low variation on all of the control charts. On the run charts, it's a slightly different set of rules that it's looking for, but it will automatically detect and display the rules that are relevant to either the run chart or the control chart, depending on what you've chosen, essentially. So you've got that as well. What's next? Before I come out of the chart, it's worth talking about how you can kind of export this information. So we're still in Life QI, we've been adding our data and kind of working on it there. If I want to export either the chart or the data that sits within that chart, I can do so using the actions button at the top here. So if I click into that whilst viewing this particular chart, we've got a couple of export options here. Export the data sheet. So that will give me a CSV file or an Excel file type download with all of that data from that data sheet underneath the chart, as well as the individual data points. It will give you information as to, you know, was there special cause variation? If so, what was there a note? What was the note? Which PDSA cycle was it linked to? Which phase of the chart? All of that sort of extra bits of information is output against every data point as well. So you've got a lot of all of that kind of raw data that will come with it and allow you to do any extra analysis kind of offline. Or if you simply just want the chart as an image file to include in a report or presentation, you just click export image and it will download an image file for you straight away. And then worth pointing out, if you need to delete the chart itself, then you can delete that from here as well, should that be required. So come back out of the chart for a second. So we've been in there playing around with the Abbey ward chart. If you remember, we set up the Bay ward chart as well. And now that we've done that, we can see that an aggregate chart has appeared down the bottom here. So the idea of this is it's aggregating these two charts together, and it's automatically created that, and it will automatically update that as soon as these teams add data into either of their charts. We'll see the aggregate become updated basically. So this is that aggregate data line calculating that overall percentage in this scenario, and then looking for the special cause variation in the data at this level. So with maybe that was ward level data, it's going to aggregate it up to hospital level data for you, basically. So you'll see that. And yeah, as I said, you don't need to physically create that chart or update it. That will happen automatically, basically. So you've got that as well. What else have we got? One of the things I was going to mention, I guess if you are seeing progress and you are seeing kind of movement in the data in the right way, so you are seeing improvement in your charts, and detecting that using a special cause variation, and you've been able to reset your control limits and shift that center line in the right direction. A useful way of, if you like, kind of being able to share or record that progress on your project is if you come back up to your project general page and come and update your progress score. There's an important marker that's used to detect kind of progress throughout the life cycle of the project. So it stops people from having to go and read up on all of your charts and then analyze them. If you come back to the general page, you've got this progress score. So you're starting to see improvement on one or more of your charts. You can click on that change score and pick one of the appropriate scores here. And if you click into each of them, it gives you a definition of each of those. That's one of the key markers that organizations are using to record the kind of the progress and the impact of these projects. Is, how many projects have we got that are showing a 3 or more? And then to be able to spot those, be able to delve into those. So it's very important that you kind of come back and update this as you make progress with your individual charts. Something else to explain, just while I remember it, in terms of exporting the data. if you've got, if you're running a program or you're running a collaborative and you've got, lots of different charts across multiple projects, there is a way of exporting all of that data from one go. We'll jump across into one of the programs that we've got set up. So we've got a program on pressure ulcer reduction. It's got, several projects taking place within it. So we've got charts coming in from multiple projects. If I wanted to export all of that information to do some offline analysis or different aggregation, it would be fairly laborious to have to export it from each of the charts individually on all of the projects. So when in a program, if you go into actions, you get an extra export option, which is export the project measure data. And that will give you an Excel file with every data point from every chart in every project that's part of that project. So it'll give you a great long, big spreadsheet, depending on how many projects you're running. So that's a particularly useful resource if you do need to do that kind of that offline analysis, basically. Okay, those are some of the main things I was going to go through. I'm going to pause for a second. Kerry, Erica, have we got any other questions you want me to touch on or that need answering?
I can't see any questions at the moment. There was one that came in slightly earlier just with regards to the P chart. Are there any other charts that we can use? But I can see Erica's gone back to that person in the feed. I can also see some people have started to download the SPC ebook. So I'm happy to post that into the chat again because it's really helpful and basically goes over some of the information you're talking about, Jace. So anybody that wants to ask a question, please feel free to go to the Q&A box because we've still got time to answer some questions. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, great. A couple more things I'll mention briefly then. So in terms of some help resources, we've obviously shared some links from things like the blog and things like that. But there's also other places or other avenues to get specific guidance on how to use the bits of functionality. There's a couple of ways of doing that. At the top of most of the pages, you'll see a get help with link. So because I'm on a measures page, it says get help with measures. When I was on the program, get help with programs, basically. Back to this one. If you click on that, it will open up in a separate tab. It will open up the help center, which is kind of the online help center that's got all of the how-to articles. And it's taken me straight into the measures and charts section. Within this, there's a whole series of individual articles that will help choosing the right chart, how to create a measure, how to create a chart. These are the more detailed step-by-step guides on how to do of everything in the platform, basically. Click into one of these, I'll give you an example. So the creating a measure one, there is a short tutorial video, 2.5 odd minutes, someone guiding you through how to do some of the things that we've done today, as well as the step-by-step written guide on how to do that. So that's a really useful resource. There's tons of stuff in the help center if you haven't come across that before. Not just measures and charts, but it goes through all the different areas of the platform. So I'd totally recommend clicking on that link at the top of the page. Or the other thing is when you're in the system, this little live chat button in the bottom right-hand corner, you can click on that and there's a few options there. You can either search the help articles directly from there. You can start a live chat with our team as well. So if you're not quite sure on how to do something, particularly if you can't also find an answer in the help center, click on start a live chat and someone from our side will try and provide you some advice and guidance. So that's a really useful resource as well.
A couple of questions have just popped in, Jace.
Sure.
So firstly, what do you use aggregate charts for?
Okay, let's go back, pick that one up. So go into this one. So the example here, if we're measuring the number or say the percentage of patients that have got pressure sores, fairly common example is if we're measuring that at multiple locations. So if we're measuring on a ward by ward basis, we want to see how many, this chart will tell us how many people on Abbey ward or percentage of patients on Abbey ward that have got pressure sores right now and the percentage of patients at Bay ward. It's kind of useful to be able to see that at a fairly granular level. But also I might be interested in saying and looking across our entire hospital, what percentage of patients have got pressure sores right now? And are we seeing improvement at an individual ward level, or are we seeing enough improvement that at a hospital level, we're seeing kind of a shift in that data? The aggregate chart here is essentially kind of adding these two charts together, crudely speaking, and allowing us to see either at ward level, these charts, or at the hospital level, how well are we doing? What percentage of staff, of patients, have got pressure sores, and is that percentage increasing or decreasing at a hospital level? So it's not necessarily relevant to every project, but those where you are able to measure locally and then aggregate it up, it can be an extra kind of insight that you can kind of help understand where you're seeing improvement or where you're really not seeing improvement, where you're seeing the opposite of that, and what impact that's having on the overall performance of the organization versus just kind of an individual ward or location, basically.
Thank you. Another question that's popped in, is it possible to merge two charts to look at the difference, say, between Abbey ward and the other ward into one chart, which I think is probably what you've just covered?
I guess there's potentially a slightly different take on that, which is, less about aggregating them and having one data line. I think maybe it's asking more about, can you have sort of the two data lines? Can we overlay the two charts, the two data lines onto one chart? If that is the question, then the answer to that right now is no, that's not possible. But we are building that functionality basically so that you would be able to overlay multiple charts, multiple lines onto one chart, and then be able to kind of compare one ward to another. At that point, it would become a line chart and not a control chart, because you wouldn't be able to have the control limits for each of the data lines. It would be a mess. But it would show, how well Abbey ward's doing and then how well kind of the Bay ward's doing. So yeah, we are working on that functionality, and that is going to become available basically, as well as other kind of custom views of how you can display multiple charts next to each other on a page.
Okay, that's great. Another question has popped in. I've been using run charts. Can I check how you calculate the center line? It doesn't appear to be the median, so I just want to double check how it's been calculated.
Sure. That's a good question. I might have forgotten the answer to that, because it is different on a run chart than it is on the control charts. And I can't remember off the top of my head how we calculate that. Erica, I don't know whether you remember how we do that. I might have to look that up and come back to you on that one. Because is it just the mean on a run chart?
It is that somebody's just popped in the Q&A and said it's the mean.
I'm pretty sure
Thank you, Kerry. The mean is the run chart.
The median is the run.
Thank you, Kerry.
Yeah.
Great. There's just another question here. With the aggregate charts, are you able to see the difference between the two charts, the one you are currently showing as one chart?
On the aggregate will only show you this kind of one data line, as it were, that aggregated data line. And I said it's not really possible to easily compare these two at the moment. What I can do from here is I can just click on the Abbey ward chart and it will pop that one open for me. So I kind of have a look at Abbey ward. I'm going to close that and quickly pop up the Bay ward, but I'm not able to kind of side by side the charts on one page at the moment. That's one of the other things that we're working on with the charting updates, is these, as well as more customization and options on the look and feel of the charts, it's also the displays of those. So be able to see Abbey ward chart next to the Bay ward chart and have the aggregate chart displayed underneath, so kind of 3 charts on the page or more, as the case may be, as well as the option to kind of overlay those lines. Those are definitely some of the kind of most requested charting features that we're working on that have been built but aren't quite ready to be released. So there's still a little bit of work to be done before that becomes available in the live platform, basically.
And one final question here says, for the aggregate charts, would the dates be the same?
Yeah, so what it's doing here is it's basically looking at the individual charts that you've got, and it's looking at the dates there, and it will plot the earliest date on the aggregate chart will be the earliest date of any of these charts, and the latest date will be the latest date on any of these charts, basically. And it's in order to get that aggregate, that's why it was important that we picked one of those fixed time frequencies. So we picked monthly, and that way every time we add a new row, Life QI can detect, January 2022 on this chart, it's able to line it up with January 2022 on this chart, because I've kind of picked from the calendar essentially. Whereas if I'd picked custom no date, you would just be typing and the formats might be different and it wouldn't be able to automatically aggregate it. But yeah, because you've done that, you don't need to do anything to set this timeline at all.
Great. I don't know if there's any more questions. I know we're coming up to time, or if there's anything else to add.
Sure. Hopefully that's been helpful. We've flashed a few more resources and links that I think have probably been shared in the chat during the course of the last 45 minutes, but they're there and we can perhaps drop them in the chat thread quickly now. Whole bunch of useful links. Appreciate we spent 45 minutes going through quite a lot of information fairly quickly. So hopefully that wasn't too much of a whistle-stop tour, but was useful. As I said, if you want to check out the help center, there's lots of those individual help articles broken down to give you more of a bite-sized step-by-step guide. So yeah, feel free to follow up there. And I guess we can send out the recording for this as well if people want to watch it back in slower time as well. But yeah, thank you. Hopefully that was helpful.
That's great. There was just one more question with regards to the recording. Yes, that will be available, like Jason said, to everyone that has joined and also couldn't make it. So there'll be a link in an email. And the next tutorial session, when is that? I will share a link in the chat now. And you'll be able to see the next webinars that are available. The next theme webinar is going to be about driver diagrams and PDSAs, which will be up on the webinar page in the next 24 hours. But if you're interested in any of our getting started Life QI webinars, feel free to sign up and join to those. Also, we offer office hour webinars, which enable you to drop in and ask any questions you have about the system. So if you'd like to join us on the office hours webinars, please do sign up to those, because it's been really helpful to have that informal chat on those webinars. Thank you very much for joining, everyone.